Hi, Grandma here, and I am reading Mr. Lincoln's Drummer, Chapter 9. In Chapter 8, we found that they were on their way to Richmond, which has been one of their big goals. Summer days in Virginia stretched themselves, and as the weather improved, we learned to look back on the cooler days of May with a degree of fondness. The Army of the Potomac was settling in on the outskirts of Richmond, but the generals didn't seem in any great hurry to push the rebels into a fight. Rumor of all sorts spread through our company. Some said the rebel president, Jefferson Davis, was packing up the government and heading south. The new rebel commander, a fellow named Robert E. Lee, was considered by most to be too old and tired to offer us much resistance. After all, General McClellan had already chased Lee around the mountains of West Virginia the year before. I myself saw no evidence of Rebs heading anywhere. They were improving their lines, and our pickets fired at their scouts. Rebel cavalry was probing our flanks, and from time to time, a few of the guns would fire into our lines. Meanwhile, up in the Shenandoah Valley, Stonewall Jackson thrashed two different Union armies, and there was a rumor Jackson had now come to Richmond, bringing 50,000 veterans with him. Old Stonewall seemed to pop up on the left, on the right, in the center, and even at Yorktown. The 3rd Vermont passed the middle part of June, building a bridge over a putrid quagmire called the Chickahominy River. It wasn't much of a stream, but no wagon could get across. "It is absolutely vital to the campaign's success that we build this bridge," Captain Harrington explained. "To avoid attacking Richmond frontally, General McClellan intends to move half the army across the river and come in behind the rebel flanks." I suppose on paper it must have made good sense, but all that country was a maze of thick woods, swamps, and streams. Sometimes you could barely walk through there single file. It was just about perfect for ambushing an enemy. Every single time our company stood guard or served as pickets, I was sure the rebels would charge out of those trees and take the whole batch of us prisoner. Bridge building was no improvement over picket or guard duty. Fortunately, I wasn't overworked myself. Most of the time I carried nail buckets or brought tools out from the quartermaster. Cal, Moses, and Russ labored particularly hard erecting the pilings, and whenever they left the river, their legs would be covered with big, fat, blood-sucking leeches. "It's just a new kind of Reb cavalry," Russ told me when I helped pluck the infernal creatures off from his thighs. "We'll have the last laugh when we parade through Richmond." I wasn't so sure about that. Stories of rebels raiding our depots miles behind the lines sent shivers up my spine. "That's all over with now," Julian told me one morning when we washed our clothes in a tub at the edge of the camp. "Jeb Stuart, the rebel cavalry general, took a few thousand men all the way around the army. They burned some wagons and looted some supplies, but it was mostly a nuisance." "Well, how do you know?" I asked. "Oh, I spent yesterday at headquarters carrying messages for Colonel Hyde," he explained. "Don't you worry, Willie. The generals know what they're doing." My teammates and I were far from certain of that. Some soldiers in General John Porter's corps captured a handful of rebel deserters. Turns out they were from Stonewall Jackson's army. "See there," I told Julian the next day, "trouble is sure to follow." "Oh, you know how rebels boast," he replied. "They were probably pickets who got tired of keeping watch and decided to come over to our lines. Stonewall Jackson, he's supposed to be up near Harper's Ferry. From what I've heard, he just about never is where he's supposed to be." "Kind of like you, huh?" Sergeant Courier barked. I turned, stiffened, and waited for the sergeant to give me a chewing out. He only waved me back to the company, and I hurried along. Those June days, I judged the Army of the Potomac had 100,000 generals. Every man in the Army had his own notion of what we should be doing. Some men were getting anxious, and we drummers and fifers passed most afternoons playing cards or tormenting our elders. I also saw Pa a time or two. Everything changed the final week of June. As I recall, it was a fine Wednesday morning, the 25th, when General McClellan finally decided to probe the enemy defenses. Every regiment in the Army formed up, took position, but only a few companies were actually sent forward. It was like Lee's Mill all over again, except it wasn't the 3rd Vermont that got shot up this time, and we lost close to 500 men. The galling thing for me was we couldn't even hear the shooting. Nobody did anything out our way. "Don't be in such a rush to see your second fight, Willie," Russ scolded me when I complained about addled generals. "Before the last one, I had 2 big brothers. Now there's just Blackie, and he's none too well." I thought about it a moment, and it tore at me some, recalling Lando's bloody chest. Waiting was almost as bad, though. It just seemed to me it was better to go ahead and get the fighting over. That night, the whole army was restless, and no one slept particularly well. Captain Harrington ordered me to spread my blankets outside his tent. "If the rebels decide to attack by night, I want you at hand, Johnston," he explained. "You can beat out assembly and rouse the men." If a few thousand Rebs started charging through the camp, I don't think a single drum would have made much of a difference. Nevertheless, the jittery captain roused me a dozen times. "What's that?" he asked the first time. "Did you hear something?" he cried later. In truth, it reminded me of looking after Charlie on a stormy night. Of course, Charlie was just 5 years old. It turned out that Captain Harrington's worries were completely unfounded. The next morning, the wind carried sounds of firing. The Rebs attacked General Porter's corps and fought them most of the day. Colonel Hyde formed our regiment, and we marched around some, but we never get in battle. On Friday, messengers arrived with word that fighting had resumed. Porter and his men had repelled the Rebs the day before. Now, General McClellan had ordered a retreat. General Brooks rode by waving his hat and encouraging our efforts, and you could feel the blood starting to pump. We cheered him wildly. And afterwards we formed up by companies and sent skirmishers out in front. Once again, the fighting took place elsewhere. The brigade was shifted from place to place, and we finished the afternoon digging up dirt and forming earthworks behind a nasty little stream. But the only good we did was to help some of the worn-out stragglers from Porter's corps. We musicians were detailed to help load ambulances with wounded, so Julian and I assisted a few men into the backs of quartermaster wagons sent out by the regimental doctors. We carried them to the small depot called Savage's Station. Then we returned to the 3rd. I passed that night with the rest of Company D, sleeping in our makeshift trench at the edge of the stream. The mosquitoes attacked us mercilessly, and the wind carried odors of scorched logs, gunpowder, and something else. A new and overpowering foul smell of blood and death. "Willie, you asleep?" Russ asked around midnight. "Not yet," I told him. "It's hard to get comfortable." "Look over there," he said, pointing to 100 flickering pinpricks of light across the swamp. "Reb campfires," he explained. "Tomorrow they'll be coming at us." "You think so?" I said nervously. "We've been lucky so far," he said, sighing. "Just poor Lando. Who do you suppose will be next?" "Well, I try not to think about it," I said, trembling. "Hope it's not me, at least not yet. I have a birthday next month. You know I'll be 12. "Sometimes I could swear you're 50, Willie." "I confess this war has aged me some. It's turned us all old," Russ observed. "I guess it's feeling death's breath." "What?" "My grandma explained it that way, Willie. She said sometimes death is so close you can feel its breath on your neck. That's just how I feel. Half of me wants to cry and the rest wants to scream." "Yes," I agreed. "It doesn't seem at all fair." "You scared?" "Sometimes," I admitted, trying to catch a glimpse of his face in the faint moonlight. "I worry that I'll run away, that I won't do what I'm supposed to, and that you or Cal or somebody will get shot because of it." "Oh, you'll do fine," Russ assured me. "Better than the captain, I bet." "He was none too steady at Lee's Mill, but I don't think he plans to hang back this time," I said. "He knows some of the men are whispering, and I hear Sam Pingree went home and talked about who crossed the creek and who didn't. I wish I hadn't. Wish Lando hadn't either." "More will get killed." "I know," Russ confessed. "They say Porter lost 5,000 yesterday." 5,000? And it's not over, Willie, not by half. I never did find any rest that night, but I did close my eyes for a time. Half an hour later, Captain Harrington shook me awake. "Pete, assembly," he whispered. "We're withdrawing." I did as ordered, and the sound of my lone drum echoed across the land. Bugles and other drums responded. Across the swamp, Reb pickets appeared, and one or two of them exchanged shots with us. Nobody appeared in a hurry to start a fight in the nest of briars and mud, though. We formed lines and withdrew by company. It seemed as if the entire Army of the Potomac was on march, only this time we were not advancing on Richmond. No, now we were heading away toward the James River and the safety of the fleet. That morning I saw General Smith for the first time since the fighting had begun. He was standing under a tall tree, writing out dispatches. Not far away, General William Franklin, commander of the 6th Corps, was likewise. It seemed odd seeing generals out on hillsides. Usually they had forests of tents around them, or they located their headquarters in houses. "Now they're no better off than you and me, Willie," Cal observed. "Some Pennsylvania fellows said there are headquarters tents and paper burning from here to the James. Seems like Porter's regiments lost most of their blankets and all their tents." For once I was thankful the quartermasters had hauled our equipment to the rear, but as fast as we were retreating, I couldn't be certain the wagons were staying ahead of the rebels. For the first time that Saturday, the 3rd Vermont occupied a position of importance. General Franklin deployed the 6th Corps along the edge of a small farm and atop a low ridge shielding Savage's station. "Boys, we're in a real pickle," General Smith said, speaking to each regiment up and down the line. "Behind us is the supply train for half the Army. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. The division hospital is back there with hundreds of General Porter's soldiers, many of them badly wounded. I cannot abide the thought of abandoning those brave comrades to the enemy. Will you fight to prevent their capture?" "Yes, sir," we howled. "I knew you would," he replied. "Vermonters have iron in their backbones. They won't flee at the first shot. We have a duty ahead of us, boys, and we'll do it, by God." As the general departed, a new spirit surged through our ranks. Each soldier checked his cartridges. Some sharpened their bayonets. No one had shaved in days, and those capable of growing chin whiskers took on a strangely sinister appearance. We must have appeared like a band of cutthroats. Well, maybe not me, but older fellows like Cal. That day we had our first true good look at the enemy. Before at Lee's Mill, they had hidden behind their earthworks or cowered behind trees. Now, they marched out in front of us on the Williamsburg Road, flags flying with their drums beating and bugles blaring. "Form line!" Sergeant Currier barked, and I beat out the command. To our right and left, the other Vermont regiments marched forward. The 5th Vermont, which had failed to advance to our aid at Lee's Mill, now led the advance. Before us, I recognized a Louisiana flag. Their banners identified them as the 5th Louisiana. The 5th Vermont charged directly at them. We too advanced, but it was our brother regiment that received most of the attention. The Louisianians leveled their muskets and fired in ranks. 1 volley, 2 volley, 3 volleys staggered the 5th Vermont. I gazed in horror as whole handsful of men fell. A withering fire rose from the woods to their left too, and the 5th simply disintegrated. Those able to fall back, others lay where they had fallen. Over 200 of them failed to stir. "Fire!" Lieutenant Buck shouted, and Company D halted, leveled their rifles, and fired. The rebels replied with a sharp volley. We were both at extreme range, and only a few men on either side were hit. I glanced around for Captain Harrington, but the dust kicked up by our feet choked the air and obscured my vision. I heard his voice call for a second volley. Then the din of rifles deafened me. A brigade messenger rode over shouting, "Withdraw! Reform!" I glanced around for someone in authority. Lieutenant Buck nodded to me. "Beat the retreat, Willie. he said sadly. The others have been driven back and our flanks are exposed. It was true. On the left, where the 5th had made its charge, a few wounded tried to drag themselves to safety. On the right, we were equally naked. Slowly we fell back, warily eyeing the Louisianians. They paused, allowing our escape. The Battle of Savage's Station, as it became known, was over. The consequences were not. The 3rd formed a new line to shield the hospital, but riders arrived ordering us to withdraw. "You can't mean to abandon all these soldiers," Lieutenant Buck shouted. "There are only a few rebel regiments coming and they're in no real hurry. We can hold them off." "Don't yell at me," the messenger countered. "These orders come from General McClellan. He's worried the Rebs are working around behind us. Better to give up a few wounded than lose the whole army." Most of us didn't see it that way. I didn't have a lot of experience fighting wars, but I knew it was a cowardly thing to leave your wounded behind. There were hundreds of them. "Willie, you think you can help some?" Lieutenant Buck asked. "I think so," I answered, nervously pulling out my bandage bag. "Do what you can, son. You have some time. Just don't get caught here when we leave. Understand?" "Yes, sir," I replied. Most of the regimental musicians headed over to help the doctors. We did our best to bandage the walking wounded so they might escape with the rest of the army. We loaded a few men into an empty wagon, but a major walked over and shook his head. "There's a tangle of wagons a mile and a half long up ahead," he explained. "We're burning every wagon left to keep them out of rebels' hands. I can't even be sure I can get the horses through." "Sorry," I said as I helped a one-armed 16-year-old out of the wagon. "You did what you could," he told me. We were able to give each of the wounded an extra blanket. The quartermasters were doling out blankets, shoes, all sorts of food. I split a can of peaches with Julian Scott, and each of us acquired a new pair of boots. What remained was set alight. It pained me seeing all those supplies turning into ugly gray smoke, but I knew the generals were determined not to give the rebels a greater victory than they had earned. We did our best to make the wounded soldiers comfortable. It was hard. They knew the grim chance of surviving their wounds. When they were prisoners, the odds only grew worse. I tried to avoid their helpless gazes. Ghostly eyes peered out of bloody bandages, and legless cripples stared bitterly as we prepared to march away. Behind the hospital rose a mound of amputated arms and legs, and beyond that, the long rows of blanket-covered corpses. "It's time," Lieutenant Buck called, pointing to an approaching line of rebels. I grabbed my drum and raced to take my place at the head of our column. The advancing Rebs began to shout, and I took out my sticks and began beating the drum. I hit it harder and harder. It was as if all my fear and sorrow of 100 wars flowed into my fingers. "Willie, you'll have need of that drum," Cal said, clamping his hands onto my arms. "Beat it a hair softer." I glanced up at him and frowned. He nodded, and I resumed my drumming. I could hear the regiment's other drummers likewise softening their beat. We now hoped only to muffle the moans of the wounded and the pounding of our hearts. Only that. Whew. Well, that was a very emotional chapter. I sure hope they make it safe, and I hope that their wounded are not captured and they figure out a way to go back and retrieve them. We'll find out in the next chapter. Bye-bye.